so what I thought I would do here is talk a little. I mainly was of course I'm going to focus on the current president and what's happening, but I wanted to give the perspective of what it's been like to engage and be writing about environmental topics in different contexts. And essentially, just for a little perspective, I had covered Congress for years. In 2004, I went to the national editor of the Washington Post and said, I've done the math and I've devoted a third of my life to spending time with Tom DeLay, and I need a change, and what's my next? And I say this book, and I actually had a fantastic relationship with Tom DeLay and many of his aides, some of whom went to jail, but that's sometimes, what happens. And, maybe some of my reporting contributed to that, well, jury's out. But so I switched to cover the environment beat, which I did from 2004 to 2013, and so essentially covered the George W. Bush administration in that capacity, as well as half of Obama's term. And then, interestingly, the managing editor asked me to switch to the White House, which I actually really didn't want to do because I was enjoying covering the environment so much. But I ended up switching, covering Obama's second term, and then now I cover domestic policy in a particular framework, which I'll discuss. But that gives you a sense of what happened. So what's really interesting, so when I came on the beat to cover the environment in 2004, it was fascinating. A colleague of mine, when I said, what are some issues that I should be focused on? And this colleague, in all seriousness, a wonderful colleague who's now with Politico, Mike Grunwald, who wrote a great book, for example, about the Everglades, which some of you might be familiar with, called The Swamp. He said, there's this issue of climate change that's becoming increasingly important, and I think you might want to look into it. And so that gives you a sense of the perspective of what it was like. And so I, dutifully started looking into that and other topics. And when I looked at what was happening, for example, in the administration, there really was a battle, which of course now will sound familiar, where you had political appointees who were editing scientific documents at war with their own agencies at times. So, for example, Phil Cooney worked to edit climate change reports that were coming out of the Council of Environmental Quality. He was someone who had been an oil lobbyist, went on to return to that capacity, but basically tried to, change the science. You had Julie McDonald, a senior interior official who took endangered species findings and actually, again, kind of edited the science to change the conclusions. That is, to this day, we'll see over time that that's one official where I can actually point to. I wrote those stories and she stepped down. And it really was a very, obviously, endangered species is an incredibly contentious issue and has huge implications. But it was a fascinating time because when I was writing about it, I both saw, again, kind of the battle that you can have over what kind of science you can do. But what was interesting is President Bush it turned out, was quite sensitive about his record on endangered species. And it turned out that he was cognizant of how it might be different from his father's. And at one point I wrote a story about how he was approaching listing decisions and how it was different, not just from Bill Clinton and, but also George H.W. Bush. And there was a press official in the Interior Department who called me up. And I remember being angry about this piece because it didn't make the front page. And so he called me up and he said, you've just made my life hell today. I can't believe, you wrote that story. And I said, look, it was accurate. It was based on these numbers and I don't understand why you're so upset. And then he said, well, the big guy, 1600 Pennsylvania, called up and he wanted to know what was going on and why his record was different. And to this day, I'm convinced there was a very endearing picture of a prairie dog that ran along with that story. And I'm betting that he saw the prairie dog and that's why he read that story. But the jury is out. There's impossible to tell. And then the third issue that I, of course, focused on was what was happening in the Environmental Protection Agency, where you saw officials really struggling with, again, some of the science that they were finding out. And I was working on issues concerning PFOA, a chemical in rocket fuel, which actually has leaked here and elsewhere. And again, there was a debate between career officials and political appointees on how to handle it. There was also the issue of what was happening with carbon dioxide and how to regulate it after 2007, the Supreme Court ruled that it is a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. You really saw an intense debate within the agency about how they were going to handle it. Eventually, Steve Johnson, the administrator at the time, essentially decided to basically come up with conclusions and not send them over to the White House, and that's how he solved that riddle temporarily. And what was interesting is that you had that going on, but at the same time, there were ways in which, for example, the Bush administration was looking at how to address these things, and particularly had interest in the president leaving his environmental mark. And one of the ways that happened the most clearly was in ocean conservation, which is something I wrote about a lot. Part of it was I concluded when I was on this beat that lots of people write about climate change and fewer people care about sharks and what's under the ocean, and therefore that is my competitive wheelhouse, and I will write about that. And what was fascinating there is that you had a group of scientists who really wanted to have marine protected areas and wanted to expand those protections. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but there were really kind of two people who were extraordinarily influential in getting President Bush to declare what became known as Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Monument was the northwestern Hawaiian Islands when he first designated it a little over a decade ago. And they went to two people. One is Jim Connaughton, who was chair of the Council on Environmental Quality and is an avid scuba diver, and brought him out there and showed him the resources. And the second was First Lady Laura Bush, who's a birder. And they talked to her about what were the incredible seabirds that were there. And so really through making the pitch to those, kind of a very concerted, we would call that a grass tops lobbying campaign, they really brought this issue to the fore. And what we saw was both the designation of Papahanaumokuakea and then later the Pacific Remote Islands National Marine Monument, Rose Atoll, and the Marianas Trench. And so even at a time when really essentially the president had disavowed the Kyoto International Climate Agreement and was pursuing all these other paths, he had fished recreationally and found a way to connect to these issues, and certainly that was something that his administration was engaged in. And so then again, I'm covering the environment, I'm plugging along, and Barack Obama's elected. And interestingly, I covered John McCain and Sarah Palin during the primary and then general election, and the difference between John McCain and Barack Obama in that campaign was by 2050, John McCain had proposed a national limits on greenhouse gas emissions that would reduce our carbon output 80% by mid-century, and Barack Obama had pledged to reduce it by 90% by mid-century. But essentially, John McCain had a stronger record historically on working on these issues, and there was very little distinction. So, I kind of thought, all right, this Democrat's coming in, he's going to really, dig into these issues and write and be very vocal about them. And while initially there was engagement as the Democrats worked to try to see if they could pass climate legislation through the House, as soon as essentially they ran into trouble, the administration ran away from that issue. And one of the most interesting kind of conversations I had to have during that first term is when I would talk to White House officials, and I would make a distinction between, if I talked to Lisa Jackson at the Environmental Protection Agency or, Jane Lubchenco at NOAA, these were scientists, people with experience who were very engaged in the issue. But whenever I talked to White House officials about things, they were incredibly defensive and really did not want to talk about issues that they considered politically damaging when they were, facing the prospect of a re-election in 2012. And it got to the point where, for example, I interviewed a White House official about the precedent-setting move that the Obama administration did to put a limit on carbon emissions from cars and light trucks. and she wanted to talk about how it was going to save consumers money and it was going to reduce fuel consumption. And when I asked whether, could we talk about this in the context of climate, did she see it as addressing climate, it really was a word that she was not even willing to utter. And that was just my experience time and time again. And it continued to the point that when I was writing about the administration contemplating regulating greenhouse gas emissions from existing power plants, I had a White House press officer call me and scream at me, just blast me for how dare I suggest that they do what, frankly, I knew they were going to do. And they did. But it gives you a sense of how I think, in many ways, politicians view this issue. Now, maybe to some extent this is changing, but there is no question that because there has not been and continues to be, and I've seen this for a long time, there simply isn't the kind of voter intensity on this issue as other issues. It's something that even those who might have sympathy for them are very reluctant to support. But of course, Barack Obama decided to do an about-face in his second term. And there are a few different factors for that, one of which is that he came to the conclusion that these issues were important and he wanted to engage on them. The second is that when he found himself with very few options in terms of accomplishing anything legislatively, whether it was on immigration, whether it was on, the economy, that the environment was one of those places where he could actually make an impact. And so he engaged and he empowered the people below him to move, obviously, quite aggressively. And then the third factor is someone who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, was John Podesta, who served just about a year as an advisor to former President Obama, essentially coming in very late 2013 and serving through 2014. And really, John Podesta, who had also worked for Bill Clinton, considered not only climate change but public lands protections as one of his highest priorities, and made the case to the president that this was an area where he could have impact. And we saw this expressed in just a number of different fronts. Clearly, they had already started moving in terms of some of their executive actions on climate and through the EPA, but then you saw a huge drive to establish national monuments, which President Obama pursued really dramatically in his second term when you compare it to his first term. You saw just in a range of things, he started speaking and engaging on it, and as a result, some of his top officials were willing to talk about it in a way they hadn't. And so you just saw, a massive shift in orientation, which really, of course, led to some very concrete outcomes. Now, again, one of the challenges when you have political polarization is that because all of these actions were pursued unilaterally, there was a bet that the Obama administration was making, which was that really for all of them to be solidified, you would need a Democratic successor. And if they weren't, they would all be vulnerable. And obviously, that's what we've seen. And so, bringing to my beat, so I covered I covered the White House. I was bureau chief for the White House bureau chief for the Post in the last few years of Obama's tenure, and then we had the election in November a year ago, and about a week after the election, the national editor brought me into his office and he said, so, we're kind of figuring out how we're going to cover this new administration and what we're going to do in terms of staffing. And he said, I think what would be the best use of your talents is for you to cover the dismantling of what Barack Obama did on the environment and other issues, including healthcare, which is something else I covered. And we had a discussion and literally said, okay, so this will be the dismantling beat. That is what I will be charged. I will be a bureau of one looking at both what happens to some of these policies, and then I proposed broadening out to say, what does this say about how government works? And is Donald Trump and his deputies, are they going to actually change the way government functions? And so, we decided that made sense. I knew the policies, I knew people who had worked on it on both sides. But I think it's fair to say that I geared up. I already knew things like the Congressional Review Act and things that you could use to rip apart regulations that had been passed recently. But I don't think either my editor or I at that moment had any idea how extraordinarily busy I would be come late January. And that is, what we've what we've been faced. And it has been a fascinating case study to go from writing about, frankly, a fairly furious effort and push to put all these policies in place, to then the effort to unwind them, and what does that look like, and what does it end up meaning in terms of in terms of its real world impact, but also how does that affect the government and these people who have toiled on these issues. And so, for example, in April, I try to write stories that both write about the policies, but also, what's the lobbying and how do these things come about. And in April, I did a story where there was literally kind of a wish list that the business community came up with. They were allowed to send proposals into the Commerce Department to say, these are the laws and regulations that we think are most harmful to what we're doing, that if you eliminate them, they will be unleashed, and business will be unleashed, and growth will come back. And the reason I looked into it is because and this was someone who, I don't reveal my sources, but this is someone who was fully supportive of everything that was going on, noted, the overwhelming number of recommendations that come in from the business community are targeted at EPA and what they're doing. And so when you look at the different regulations, they included things like a request to undo the waters of the United States, the Clean Power Plan, other rules on methane, and just a host of regulations. And I wrote that story in April, and as we stand here now in October, the vast majority of proposals that the administration has done on the spring, received in the spring on the environment, basically they've taken action on virtually every one of them. Now again, many of these are being contested in court. These things take a long time to proceed, and I think it's going to be a while until we know exactly what the upshot is. But I think what's important to know is that this is one of the areas where plenty of Democrats like to tease Trump about, oh, you haven't accomplished that much, but in fact, really this is an area where they've moved relatively swiftly, particularly if you compare it to taxes or infrastructure or other priorities on the president's agenda. And so when you look at kind of the landscape and who's really effective, I am convinced that Scott Pruitt is one of the most effective cabinet members that Donald Trump has. He is personally liked by the president and has come to earn his respect, but really this is someone who was quite familiar with EPA and what it was doing, because he filed roughly a little over a dozen lawsuits trying to reverse the regulations adopted and pursued by the Obama administration. But so he came in with a vision of what he wanted to do, and he has methodically, both with a relatively small group of political appointees, taken action on a wide number of fronts. And then you have someone like Ryan Zinke, who's more of an iconoclast, although interestingly, this is someone who was supported by some folks in the outdoors community initially. Almost all of those folks who saw him as, he describes himself as a Teddy Roosevelt Republican, at this point have raised certain questions, but this is someone who is from the West, but is deeply invested in kind of two priorities. One is domestic energy production, which is really an organizing principle. As someone I know was describing it recently, this is someone who was a Navy SEAL who did serve overseas and really came to see reliance on foreign oil as a huge problem, as a national security threat, and something that ultimately could cost American lives. and is very determined to kind of change things so that we can expand our fossil fuel production, and who believes in empowering local communities. He believes there's a federal role, but certainly what we're seeing when he looks at, for example, some of the national monuments established by the previous administration, he is very invested in empowering local communities who have been opposed to some of those designations. And so then in terms of, what this ends up meaning in terms of my day-to-day and that of my colleagues, it wouldn't surprise you that our workload has escalated. So to just put it again in perspective in March, I'll celebrate my 20th anniversary at the Washington Post. And during my first year, I was the most prolific writer on the news staff. I attribute this jointly to Ken Starr and Bill Clinton, since I was covering his impeachment, and I blame both of them for the repetitive stress injury I developed. And so I wrote more than 200 stories, and that was more than anyone else on the paper across the staff. So compare that to the first 100 days of Donald Trump's presidency, where I wrote 92 stories, including 17 on the front page, and I was out of the country for a week on vacation with my family. So when you do the math, again, it basically was 100 stories in 100 days. And so while, again, it's a fascinating time, and I really get to write about substance day in, day out, you can get a sense that it's fairly overwhelming. And so, one of the things that I also have seen is that that's interesting is that I got a lot of hostile emails particularly during the campaign season, even when I wasn't covering it. And again, I've really been, as someone who focused on political science as an undergrad and has been writing on politics for my whole career, it is somewhat disheartening to see the level of vitriol that you get, again, depending on who's in office and who you're writing about, kind of the intense hatred that Americans have for the media, as well as for, politicians they disagree with. One of the things I would say that I find encouraging, even though I think everyone would say that we're still a very polarized country, is that I am getting feedback from people of both parties about their investment in journalism and that they see this as something valuable. So it does seem like a time, and again, people are sending me internal documents and sharing information that there is kind of a broader community investment in governance and in the expression of information than I've seen for a while. And so I would say that I find that encouraging. And then, I just wanted to share, when we talk about, obviously, Leslie was talking about science and the importance of science at the outset. One thing we monitor is kind of, what constitutes an attack on science. And I think that this is extremely important, that when you look at what's happening, that I try to be as fair as possible and not call things, for example, censorship when I don't think they're censorship, but they're really kind of, my colleague Chris Mooney talks about 5 categories. There's misinformation, suppression and interference, intimidation, cuts in funding, and undermining the US scientific workforce. And I would, argue that, for example, on misinformation, there's no question that we see false statements, although, again, I always think it's very interesting, where are they coming from? Are they coming from, say, a top official who's working in this, or is it an offhand comment from, a very senior administration official who's not actually working day in, day out? In terms of suppression and interference, I would argue that at this point, there's not the kind of acts of suppression and interference that I was documenting at the start of my career. Now, we really have to see what happens over time, and there's no question that there's, for example, I would say it kind of depends what category you're talking about. There's for example, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Interior Department and other agencies, they've absolutely taken down data that used to be accessible. We've written a lot about that. And so there's no question that the availability of federal data has changed, and that's something we're going to monitor, but there's a distinction between that and actually taking the work product of, for example, a federal employee and altering it. So it'll be certainly interesting to see. We've seen, kind of, again, political appointees censoring kind of what grants get awarded or how they solicit it. So there's a shift in priorities, but does that translate into actually changing actual findings? In terms of intimidation, I think that that's something that certainly is both, to some extent occurs, but is also a little harder to measure, because in many cases we're talking about how do individuals who are operating in these agencies and in the government, censor themselves or change the way that they operate. And then in terms of cuts to funding, what's very interesting, and we'll see over time, is that there's no question that if you look at the budget that the administration offered earlier this year, they made drastic cuts. There was a proposal to cut EPA by 31%. The cut to the Interior Department was smaller, but still very significant in certain areas. But Congress has pushed back to some extent, and I mean the Republican majority in Congress has pushed back and restored funding to many of these key areas. So that, does show the interplay between the two branches. And the last category, in terms of undermining the U.S. scientific workforce, that's a longer term issue that honestly we won't be able to measure it until well after, whether Donald Trump serves 1 or 2 terms after he would be out of office. For example, are scientists less interested in serving for the government? And for example, just broadly speaking, as a child of 2 retired but government employees, I have always felt that we want people to be invested in public service regardless of who's in office. And does that change? Do people feel, again, of either party, that they can only serve for the president of their party, and what impact would that have on their government? And so the last thing I'll leave you with is that, again, because I really enjoy covering the Antiquities Act and going to some of these, places across the country that have, incredible resources, I have enjoyed writing on it. And one of the really interesting things is that on August 24th, Ryan Zinke was able to was offering his recommendations of what he wanted to do. We were briefed that this would become public later in the day. We would all write about it, and there was a decision made to keep the report confidential and that they wouldn't release it. And it really was one of the worst days I've had in the newsroom in a while. It was very frustrating, having spent so much time learning about these areas, going to many of them, and not being able to write about his assessment and what should be done and what does this say kind of about what we're doing in the country. And so I got some information about it, but it really didn't meet my standards, and I was furious. And then there was a Friday afternoon. I was working in the office basically a month later, and essentially a source of mine managed kind of page by page to provide me with the findings of it. And to me, and we wrote about it, and equally important, I have now become an expert in digitizing pages and images of documents and putting them up online. And to me, to be able to share that information with, frankly, a local audience, a national audience, and a global audience, that's what I'm in the business of doing, and that's ultimately what I think is one of the really rewarding aspects of my job. And so with that, I'd love to take questions, because I'm sure you're going to have a lot of them. Okay, yes, go ahead.
You've interviewed me a couple of times, but you don't remember. And you asked good questions.
Thank you.
What would you consider the state of local environmental journalism to be outside of Washington?
Right, that is a good question. I think that there are real challenges. I think that there are certain communities and areas where it's something that really matters. And so, for example, like in California and the Pacific Northwest, there's kind of reporting that comes out of there that I see periodically that I feel like it's a priority for, those outlets, whether they're, again, like, print, radio, television, and they really dig in. Florida, I've seen more, for example, on the coast, where I feel like reporters there are making a connection. I do think that these, broadly speaking, there is been a little bit of a mainstreaming of environmental journalism that's a healthy trend, that essentially people see these stories as more central. When I changed beats in 2004, people saw it as a demotion, and I think really kind of covering these issues has been seen historically as peripheral, and it's become more broadly accepted over time. But the real challenge is just in the model of journalism and the fact that there's just not the money for local journalism the way that there used to be. And even as some of the bigger outlets are thriving, I often joke, for example, when a friend of mine who's on the editorial side for the Boston Globe, we were bought out at a similar time, and I called him up and I said, is your billionaire better than my billionaire? What do you think? I argue that my billionaire is better. But so what I really think is a challenge is that again, everybody loses when that happens, because there's no way. I'm a huge believer in beat reporting and kind of being in the trenches. And again, this is my area and my trenches here, and we travel periodically, but you need folks breaking some of those stories on the local level to get attention. And so I think that it is a major problem. So, in the back.
Yeah, as an insider, what is your opinion on the argument about too many bias and opinions going into straight news stories?
Got it. I have never been, I would say two things. I have never been a fan of opinion journalism. It is not, it's not what I'm comfortable with, just, personally and temperamentally, but also I frankly think that it's just, there are very few people who I think are smart enough that they should be telling other people what to think. And so I think that there's a laziness that creeps in, that basically people who are writing with an advocacy bent often, just frankly don't produce the best journalism. I do think, it's a legitimate, where I do have sympathy, for example, when I get feedback from readers who say, we feel like they're not, we read the Washington Post and the New York Times and these other papers, and we feel like you're not as connected to Trump and you're critical. I would argue that, again, we all wrote, quite critical stories about previous administrations of both parties. But I think that, that I am empathetic to the idea that everyone has their own views, and it's really your obligation, if you're trying to be an objective journalist, to put any of your personal opinions aside when you're writing. One of the reasons, for example, that I have enjoyed covering the Environmental Protection Agency in the Trump administration is that Scott Pruitt likes to engage in dialogue about what he's doing, and his staff enjoy that. So you can go to them and say, I'm writing the story which is going to be about how you're changing the way this agency does grants. And they will say, we have a great story to tell. Like, yes, you found that out through the back door. They didn't come to me with that story. But once I had found out details and I was going to them, they went through every single grant that they had denied and explained why they did it. And to me, that's being accountable to the public, and that's the kind of interplay that you should have. And so that's, and I think our readers are better served from that. The kind of most frustrating stories I write are when I have to say, X official declined to comment, because then I feel like our readers aren't fully informed. Wait, all right, I will call on you, but I'm sure there's, all the way in the back you raised your hand. Yes?
What are your thoughts on the prevalence of false equivalency that we see in reporting that's just come around a lot? We see a lot in policy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
So that's it.
Yeah. So what's interesting, I think, for example, there used to be years and years ago, there used to be a false equivalency, on certain subjects that I think doesn't exist anymore. Like, for example, people would say, some people say that climate change is taking place and others don't. And, essentially we talk through at the Washington Post that, well, when the preponderance of evidence, the overwhelming preponderance of evidence is that human activity is contributing to climate change, that is what we will write. So it maybe depends on what you're talking about. What I will say, and I think that this is, a challenge that every reporter deals with, is that I really came to appreciate the importance of policy and substance when I switched from covering Congress, which I did for a long time, and I had kind of a superficial understanding of a lot of subjects. And then I changed, and I really got to know environmental policy, and subsequently, for example, I've really gotten to know healthcare policy. And when you really understand the substance, it allows you to get beyond kind of he said, she said journalism, which again, I draw a distinction between you should always have folks on both sides of a policy issue be able to make their best argument for what they're saying, but then you should have enough facts and context that you can put things in perspective. And I think sometimes when you see the journalism you're talking about, I think it stems from the fact that some of the reporters who are producing that work, regardless of the medium, aren't versed enough in the policy and the substance that they can provide the kind of context that, again, I would say serves everyone well. So, I don't know. Yes, go ahead.
Unfortunately, there are a lot of people in this country who have very limited media resources and don't trust what they call the liberal media. Do you have any suggestions for how we might turn that around?
Right. I mean, that's a challenging, it's a challenging problem. I think that, frankly, even though, again, there's this problem on the local level, although, it's amazing how much access to good journalism you can get without paying for it. So I actually think that for people who are most interested, they can get access to, just this in many ways, I would argue, is a golden age of journalism in terms of what's being produced. What you're referring to, of course, which I think is a real problem, is this echo chamber. And, this happens all the time. And I don't exactly know how to penetrate it, except to say that when you have people who might be inclined to, for example, read unreliable news and things like that, if you introduce them to kind of alternative sources of information, sometimes that works, and I think that that's really important. But it's hard, and again, we are in an environment, and I don't, to me, if the president calls us enemy of the people, like it doesn't keep me from, doesn't keep me up at night. But it is true that if you have kind of senior folks, I mean, there are times where I have, interactions with folks where I'll be interviewing, and at one point they'll go, "That's fake news," kind of, and I'll take it really seriously and try to defend it, and then they'll say, "No, I'm just teasing with you. I'm just kidding." But we've entered an era where this has become such a common allegation that it really has distorted, I think, people's perception of the work we're doing. So I'm always trying to figure out what are the ways, and the only way I can think of is that I write my pieces and that I really try to respond to even the most hostile messages, because I want people to know that I'm taking their concerns seriously. Yes?
I'm just curious, there have been so many instances where the Trump administration has done the stuff Scott Pruitt was talking about, Stutziki, you were talking about, the immigration bans and things like that, where various groups have challenged them.
Right.
And yet time after time, NRDC people told me they'd sued the government 50 times or something in the last 8 months.
Right.
Are they slowing that down? Is it just administrative procedures that's slowing them down?
Right.
And how is those things going to play out?
Right. Right. What you mentioned, which is a really good point, is that, and it's why I say that, it will take some time to know how much of this will stick, is that, there's so much litigation going on, and there's no question that, particularly, I think, it kind of depends on what you're talking about, but, with a lot of these environmental policies, the core laws dating back to the 70s are very ambitious laws that have set the table, and if they don't get changed, it makes it much more difficult for this administration, for example, to pursue what it's hoping to pursue. Again, it's very hard for me to predict. I don't take bets on what the D.C. Circuit does or what the court in the Northern District of California does, where for example, I now, in the same way that we would reach out to, we would check in with Scott Pruitt when he was in Oklahoma because we always knew he was the first to sue. Now I talk to Javier Becerra's office in California because every single time, even during the start of this evening, I'm writing a story on healthcare, and it came through that there's going to be a hearing on Monday on where 18 states and the District of Columbia are seeking a temporary restraining order to force Trump to pay the cost-sharing subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. And so we're seeing this kind of fast and furious litigation. And my sense is that all of these groups are fundraising, if they're private groups and if they're the states, they're getting support from different areas, that that they will be challenging these. So I think that as a result, we've seen a couple areas where already the EPA has encountered a couple of reversals on some of what it's been doing, that I generally think that it's not going to be one outcome or the other, but the fact that there are so many legal challenges that they can refer to a suite of fairly restrictive laws means that they won't be able in 4 years to certainly finalize what they're trying to do. If he has a second term, I think there's much more that can be changed through the regulatory process. Sorry, one more question. How about right over there? I think there's one. I can't see you.
The Center for Public Integrity just won an award for their series on scientists for hire, basically the white coats for hire.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not only in industry, but they're becoming part of the federal decision-making process, particularly in the EPA, like
Mm-hmm.
the committees.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if and how you can address that, or out basically people who are basically scientific hacks,
Mhm.
or who aren't real, who end up being part of the decision-making process.
Right. I think part of it is we do monitor what's happening in terms of scientific advisors, and in fact, we're expecting that next week we've already written a lot about kind of changes that have happened to advisory committees with many of these key scientific agencies, and we're going to get we're most likely going to get action within days that will give us a better sense of who's going to be appointed, and thereby be influencing these decisions. That said, a lot of this action takes place behind closed doors, and for example, we file plenty of Freedom of Information Act requests. And I actually have a great deal of sympathy for these agencies that, for example, the number of FOIA requests for EPA has gone up something like 187%. And, when you're being FOIA'd that much, it does take time to respond. And you also think that after a while you would maybe, be careful about what you put in an email. Well, and so I just don't know how much transparency we can get, but that's part of why we work very hard to maintain sources who can share information with us, whose identities we can protect, because that's the best way we can find out what's going on. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.